What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now! I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now! Is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Thank you for joining me in episode 5 of season 2 of Real Democracy Now!, a podcast. I ask all of my guests 2 questions. What for them is the essence of a real democracy? And if they could change one thing about our current system of democracy, what would it be? In episode 1.9, we heard from a number of guests I interviewed in season 1 about deliberative mini-publics on their view of the essence of a real democracy. Today we hear from guests from season 1 and 2 on the one change they would make to our system of democracy. I found the answers people have given to this question fascinating. Sometimes people want changes that directly relate to their area of interest, and other times they identify an important change in a completely different part of our democratic system. First up, we hear from Adam Cronkright from Democracy in Practice. I interviewed Adam in episode 1.12 about the work of democracy in practice in schools in Bolivia.
I think that for me, if I could change one thing about our current system of democracy, I would probably think more locally. As far as I would love to see tons of different cities have randomly selected city councils, for instance, or even just 5. And it's not so much that I think that we've got to start small and it'd be too risky to go big with a citizen senate. I think it'd be awesome to see a citizen senate. I just think that it would be really cool to have lots of different cities with their city councils or with their city governments or village governments, local groups being able to try out different approaches. And you'd have more experiments going on. You'd have more learning going on. And you'd also have people having a more intimate experience with this idea of, say, lotteries and random selection. And so if you have city councils that are randomly selected in lots of different cities around the world, then you're going to have lots of citizens get that opportunity, which a citizen senate will be somewhat limited in the percentage of the population that can actually be in the citizen senate. And I'd love to see lots of people have that experience like they're having in citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies. They tend to come out of it really revved up about the experience that they had. They tend to really believe in the process. And so you would have lots and lots of citizen advocates for this type of a process. Then when you implement it in other levels of government, such as regional and national levels of government, you have a base of citizens that have already had this experience at their local level. They can testify that it works, and they can be really strong supporters of putting that into play in a national or regional level and following through on the process to make sure that it works and giving it the time that it needs to work out the wrinkles and that type of a thing. So I think that would be fascinating personally.
Next is Professor Caroline Lee. Caroline was part of episode 1.19, which looked at different critiques of deliberative mini-publics.
Okay, so for me, it would be, and this might sound like a cop-out, but it would be that we think about the context of democratic reforms and that they're not perfect in the abstract, but that they're shaped very much by the concerns of the people who pioneered them and the people who shaped them along the way. So in the US, we need to understand that, the Electoral College, for instance, is not a perfect design. And I think that on the one hand, it's important to have respect for democratic designs, flawed as they are, and also to be open to dynamic innovations and reforms and changes along the way. So that means both appreciating the kinds of, environmental impact review processes that, are sort of roundly condemned, appreciating what those may have to offer certain groups, right? But also, being excited about new innovations and being open to those changes. So the outcome of that for me, of just sort of appreciating the context and the history of these reforms and how they are sort of inevitably products of their times. The outcome of that is going to always be this multi-layered, messy set of overlapping institutions, right? So our democracy is always going to be a little bit, jury-rigged and cobbled together of, different reforms from different eras. And I think that's okay. that it is, sort of multi-layered and messy. But I also think that that's why it's okay to critique both those, new innovations, but also those old reforms as well, that we have to continue critiquing those.
I spoke with Associate Professor Daniel Pemstein in episode 2.3 about his work on the Varieties of Democracy project and the Unified Democracy Scores.
Yeah, so in the U.S., one thing that, it's been hard to measure its effect really, really clearly, but sort of gerrymandering of electoral districts is something that at least is, I think, seriously undercutting people's faith in democracy here. In the U.S., legislatures are responsible for drawing their own electoral districts, right? And so naturally, this leads to a situation where districts can look really, really weird and be strategically drawn, right, in order to capture or thin out certain populations within the electorate in a particular district. And it's not particularly clear if moving away from this model would change things all that much, right? So there's a lot of disagreement in the literature about this. But at least the perception of it is it undercuts our sort of faith in our elections. And I think, especially in the context of recent events in the U.S., faith in elections is a little shaken here at the moment, right? And I think that's one thing we could do. It might not be the most important thing. It's just like one thing that we could do to shore up faith in our electoral system.
Professor Carson was my first guest in episode 1.1, where she explained the basics of deliberative mini-publics.
I'd like Australia to continue to lead the way it started leading the way, with the first women elected to Parliament and up there with the best of them, with the women's right to vote, with the secret ballot and so on. And something terrible happened after that. There wasn't much innovation that occurred. I'd like to see Australia experiment with a citizens' Senate. Federally, I think we have opportunities at a state level to have a randomly selected upper house, so a citizens' Senate in every state. And I'd love to think that we could influence the world by doing that. We influence the world with the secret ballot, which was originally called the Australian ballot. There's no reason why we can't lead the way again. And I think that'd be a real exemplar for others to adopt.
Next is Professor Graham Smith, who has been part of a couple of episodes now. Episode 1.8, where he talked about the UK citizens' assemblies, and episode 1.18, where he outlined his approach to evaluating deliberative mini-publics.
Oh dear, our current system of democracy. I was going to say it would be good if we were all nicer to each other. That would be a good start, but that's not the system of democracy. What would I change? That's a very interesting question, and you might think that as someone who is committed to participatory democracy, that I was going to say something around, more citizens' assemblies or whatever. But actually, I think I would actually start to look at the workplace and economic democracy, and I would do something about structure of companies and shareholding as such that workers and other stakeholders had some influence on the decision-making of private corporations, such that the fiduciary duty wasn't the primary driving force of our economic institutions. So that would be my focus. And it's interesting that we've been talking a lot about political decision-making, but actually some of the most significant decisions that affect our lives are made in the economic sphere, where there's almost no democratic engagement whatsoever. So that would probably be if I could have one law that I could pass, it would be to restructure corporate governance in order to engage workers and communities more in decision making, and I would scratch out the fiduciary duty.
Professor Christina Lafont was also part of episode 1.19, where she explained her critique about some uses of deliberative mini-publics.
That's a hard one, because my list of things that need to change is so long. It's hard to choose just one thing. But I suppose that since what I'm most worried about is the many, many shortcuts by which powerful actors find ways to influence the political system much more than the general public can do, I guess of those shortcuts, the worst is the undue influence of money in politics. So I suppose I will, if I could possibly change something, I will change that undue influence. But of course, that will require different measures in different countries, depends on exactly how the political system is shaped. But for example, I mean, in the US where I am, that will require a lot of changes, from reversing the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court to engaging in campaign finance reform, strengthening the independence of the media from corporate money. I mean, just the usual suspects, I would think.
Professor Paul Cartledge was our first guest in Season 2, where he took us through a potted history of ancient Greek democracy.
If I could change one thing, it would be to abolish political parties, at least political parties as currently defined, with their rigid, more or less rigid ideological bases and their personal animosities. I would rather have voters voting, electorates electing on specific, in relation to the particular issues at stake, so that you don't feel you have to vote on a particular party line because that party is going to be the one that represents you in Parliament. I want our representatives to be free from party constraints. They were organizational bodies that organized voting, that organized people's thoughts about how people should go into politics and be chosen to represent communities. I think with the internet, with the various ways in which we are very much more fluid, we have much more self-determining ways of looking at the world, such that I doubt if very many people buy every aspect, every fundamental aspect of the manifesto of any particular political party. There will be particular aspects of the party's manifesto that they so are keen on that they override any other aspect. But parties today are, I think, an impediment as opposed to an implement for enabling and enhancing democratic participation. That's my perception.
And finally, Associate Professor Genevieve Fuji Johnson was one of the guests in episode 1.19, Critiquing Deliberative Mini-Publics.
We've got the institutions, but the institutions function in a context, and the context can be more problematic than the institutions themselves. And so I guess I've been thinking that in order to realize this true essence of democracy, in order to realize democracy, the collective self-governance based on and upholding the principle of fundamental moral equality, I think that necessitates thinking about how we distribute wealth and how we care materially for other humans. So, in other words, I think if I had to change just one thing, if I could change even just one thing, I would have to focus in on our economic structure. In other words, the capitalist system. So our democracies operate within social and political contexts. And we've seen for a long time a concentration of wealth and power at the apex of our institutions. We're really seeing this in Technicolor right now in the U.S. as Trump appoints or nominates people to his cabinet. And we see just in very, very stark terms this massive concentration of wealth. And so our democracies are, I think, certainly in the U.S., perhaps in Canada as well, to a lesser extent. Our democracies are tending toward, in this very Aristotelian sense, are tending toward oligarchies. And I don't think that didn't just happen. I think it has happened over the long course of, the history of democracy as contextualized against a capitalist or within a capitalist system that allows for, facilitates the concentration of wealth and power. And so to realize true democracy, again, I think we have to address those structural inequalities, those inequalities of poverty. that are gendered and that are racialized, and that really impact on both the capacity and the opportunities for people to participate as equals in their self-governing. An example that I raise in my book is, of a single mom. I mean, it's hard to keep yourself politically informed. It's hard to be engaged if you're, having to worry about, keeping your kids, happy and healthy and safe and so on, and to pay the bills and so on and so forth. So I think that's really key, addressing the material inequalities, addressing how we distribute wealth, how we care materially for humans. That needs to change. And then, we can carve out the time to become more informed and more active. And then we can collectively, be changing through multiple participatory avenues, some of which are mini-public, some of which are perhaps non-deliberative.
Thank you for joining me today. In next week's episode, I speak with Jean-Paul Gagnon about his work on democracy with adjectives. So far, Jean-Paul has identified over 1,400 adjectives used to describe democracy. He also tells us about a virtual city of democracy he is developing based on his work. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.